What's it like to edit the most storied food magazine in the world? Best-selling author Ruth Reichl joins us to talk about her latest book, Save Me the Plums. How did prosecutors become so powerful, and what are the consequences? My colleague Emily Bazelon will be here to talk about Charged, the new movement to transform American prosecution and end mass incarceration. To celebrate and honor National Poetry Month, we'll have a special reading by a special poet. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, our critics will talk about the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Ruth Reichl joins us now from San Francisco, where she is touring for her new book, Save Me the Plums, My Gourmet Memoir. Ruth, thanks so much for being here.
It's a pleasure.
So this is not your first memoir, but your fifth memoir. What did you want to do in this book? What inspired it?
I knew from the moment that I got the job at Gourmet that I was going to want to write this book. I was working at the New York Times.
Yes.
And as you know, journalists don't make a lot of money, and I was entering a world that was magical to me, a world of having hair and makeup people show up at your house in the morning. The Condé Nast I entered, the closest thing I can compare it to is the Court of Versailles under Louis XIV, complete with courtiers and people who hate. I mean, it was operatic and wonderful and strange, and I knew I wanted to write about that world. And I also wanted to write about that particular moment in American food culture. I mean, it was such a time of change. Food was starting to come really into the culture. And I thought it was something wonderful to write about. And on top of that, I felt as if those 10 years, it was a time of enormous change in media. And as one friend said to me, this was the last great time.
Yes.
And I wanted to write about what it was like, what that world of magazines was like, knowing that it was never coming again.
Sadly, in some ways. So you left there in 2009. You were there for 10 years, as you said, but you've waited 10 years to write about it. Did you kind of want to wait for, I don't know, certain people to be gone, or?
No, not that at all. I think you're better off with memoir letting it percolate a little. And certainly when I left there, I was so devastated. I was in no shape to write much of anything. I mean, I basically went into my kitchen and cooked for a year before I was able to do anything. And then as I really started thinking about the book, it became clear to me that I really wanted to tackle a lot more than just the media, that I wanted to write a book that was useful for people who weren't in the media or weren't necessarily interested in food, that I had the extraordinary experience of learning to become a leader, become a boss. I took over 65 people, and who was I to tell 65 people what to do? And learning how to be a manager was a huge learning curve, and really a lesson not just for managers, but for life, I think.
Well, I want to talk about the before and the during and the after of your Gourmet tenure. But let's start with the hardscrabble, gritty before of working as the restaurant critic and food editor at the New York Times. What was it like when you were at the Times doing that job? Because I'm sure it has also changed a lot.
Yes, it has indeed. But I mean, when I moved to New York to be the restaurant critic, 93, Times Square was still really gritty. It was before the whole transformation. And, if you worked late, a guard walked you to the subway. And as a friend of mine said, I was writing about a life of luxury. I was spending a lot more in restaurants than I was making as a salary. And so I wrote about luxury, but I didn't live it. And the job of being a restaurant critic at the Times in those days, I mean, people would say, and mean it, I read you religiously. The voice of the critic was huge, and I wasn't quite prepared for that coming from L.A., where the critic was not nearly as important or revered. And I came in behind Brian Miller, who was very Eurocentric. And I had lived in California for 20 years, and I really wanted to write about Asian food. And one of the first things I did was write about food carts because I thought they were an important part of New York life, and they deserved to be taken very seriously. And so I think I changed the way restaurant reviews were being written in that moment in New York, or I was trying to anyway.
Did you like being a restaurant critic?
I loved it. I mean, anybody who tells you they don't like being a restaurant critic is either stupid or lying. It's an amazing job if you like food.
Yeah. Did you like the power that it had? I mean, you describe scenes where you meet chefs who say their lives were destroyed by a negative review.
I did not like the power. And my guess is that no really good critic does. I mean, you're not in it for that. And I also came from a time, I mean, at this point in my life, I've been writing about food for 50 years. And when I started, there was a handful of us who cared about food. And chefs, growers, writers, we were all in it together. And so coming into a place where the critic is really the adversary in many ways of the restaurant was very uncomfortable for me.
How did you end up getting to gourmet? Because the job of an editor-in-chief at a Condé Nast magazine is not one that you just kind of send your resume into. You were summoned. You were called.
I was summoned. Summoned is the exact right word. I was summoned by Cy Newhouse, an extremely eccentric billionaire owner of Condé Nast, and I said, yeah, you're crazy. What do I know about magazines? I'm a newspaper writer. I'm not a manager. I'm a writer. The magazine has meant so much to me growing up. And, the idea that they really wanted to make it better than it was, as good as it could possibly be, was very exciting to me, but I didn't think I was the one to do it. And I kept saying, no, I'm not the one. Cy, for many reasons, kept saying, yes, you are, I want you to do this.
So for those who are not foodies or perhaps are not American and did not grow up with Gourmet magazine, talk a little bit about the role Gourmet played in your life growing up and then also in the sort of cultural and food world of America.
Gourmet magazine was, for much of its time, the Bible of food. And it was started by a man named Mr. McCausland, who started it in 1941, a very strange time to start a food magazine, just as the country is on the brink of war. But he really believed that the magazine had something to offer to Americans. And it was the first Epicurean magazine in America. And I discovered it as a very little girl. I was probably the only 8-year-old in New York with a subscription to Gourmet magazine. But I had the enormous good fortune to read at the age of 8 an extraordinary piece that they had published by Robert Tristram Coffin, who was the poet laureate of Maine and a Pulitzer Prize winner and a beautiful writer. I read this piece about rowing out to get lobsters in the starry sky and building this big fire and boiling the lobsters and falling asleep on the island. And it was transformational for me. The first time I understood that nonfiction could be as magical as stories about witches and elves and princesses. And it was really transformational for me, that this notion that food could be a way of looking at the world. And I think that the magazine operated that way for many, many people. Many people of my generation grew up learning to cook with this magazine. It opened the world to many people. And if you look at the magazine over the course of history, I mean, it really sort of changed every 10 years. And it is a history of American food.
So it's not just then recipes and how-tos, but really a magazine about the culture around food and about food writing.
Yes, and in its earliest days, it pretty much shared writers with the New Yorker. And extraordinary things that most people don't know about the magazine. Ray Bradbury's Dandelion Wine started as a story in Gourmet. Annie Proulx's first published story, I think, was in Gourmet. MFK Fisher wrote for the magazine. Really, really important writers wrote in the magazine. And it was literary, and it was at a time when, in its early days, when consideration of food was a pretty much elite occupation. It was made for the elites. And then it gradually started approaching recipes. I mean, they didn't have a test kitchen early on. But as American women started taking cooking really seriously, suddenly the magazine decided that they were going to be the place that had the most reliable recipes anywhere, which they did. And so you sort of watch this change in food culture through the magazine.
What did you want to bring to that magazine? Did you feel like it needed to change, to shift in some way? What was your sort of guiding idea going into Gourmet in terms of what you could do with the magazine?
Well, interestingly, I mean, the reason that they came after me was because I had written a piece in the New York Times as a restaurant critic saying why I'm ashamed of what I do, which both James Truman, the editorial director of the magazine, and Cy Newhouse thought was really interesting, and that they wanted someone who was, coping with the morality, the ethics of eating. And so they very much wanted me to do that. And they also wanted me to bring in younger readers because they had a very aging group of subscribers, and they looked down the road and thought, well, we better do something. And the magazine had always thought of itself as timeless, and I think magazines should be timely. And when they asked me what I thought, was the hallmark of a great magazine, I said, a great magazine doesn't give readers what it wants. It gives readers what they didn't know they wanted. I told them that American food had changed enormously, and that there were all these issues of is genetic modification a good thing or a bad thing? Shouldn't we be looking at that? I was very concerned about overuse of antibiotics and confinement animal facilities, and I thought all of those were issues that belonged in an Epicurean magazine. And the magazine had stopped using the great writers that it had in the past. And I said, I want to go to the best writers and ask them, even if they're not food writers, ask them to write for us. And they wanted all of that in the magazine.
So I want to get to some of those star writers like Ann Patchett and David Foster Wallace. But first, all of that, what you were saying, sounds very important, also a little bit grim. But coming to Condé Nast at that time, that was a fun place to work. What was it like compared with the New York Times? What was the corporate culture of Condé Nast?
I literally did not know that people lived like that. I mean, for me, it was very Cinderella. Going in, and editors had clothing allowances, hair and makeup people, arriving at your office to fluff you. Absolutely endless expense accounts. You would go to the Four Seasons for lunch and just get up when you were done and leave, and the bill would appear at your secretary's desk at some point. Drivers, cars, country clubs. I think, Cy Newhouse, who was a billionaire, wanted his editors to live like him. And, as someone who had literally never been in a limousine before, or flown first class, or stayed in a 5-star hotel, it was literally falling into the lap of luxury. New York Times writers don't live like that.
There's so much good gossip in here around the magazine world. You mentioned James Truman, who was editorial director at the time, Anna Wintour, of course, the editor of Vogue. And I'm going to leave all of that for readers to discover. But I do want to talk about one person who wrote for the magazine under you, and that's David Foster Wallace, who did his very famous essay on The Lobster, Consider the Lobster, which became the title essay in a later collection. Just tell us a little bit about that experience from your perspective.
Well, it was Jocelyn Zuckerman, one of our editors, said, I'm going to try and get David Foster Wallace to write for us. And I said, I don't think David Foster Wallace is going to write for Gourmet, but Godspeed. See if you can get him. And she called him, and it turns out he was interested in writing for the magazine. And it took us a while to come up with the right story for him. And Jocelyn said, his mother is from Maine. Maybe he'd like to write about the Maine Lobster Festival. I said, Jocelyn, the Maine Lobster Festival motto is lobster, lighthouses, and laughter. That doesn't sound like DFW to me, but he was interested, and he went and he wrote this piece, and I think we assigned it at, 3,000 words, 4,000 words. And Jocelyn comes in with the article when it arrives, and I looked at her and said, were we expecting 10,000 words? It was a huge manuscript in her hands, and she said, well, it's DFW. I said, how is it? And she said, well, it's wonderful, but you better read it. And I'm reading along, and the open is very funny, and I'm very, laughing, and then I get to this place where he says, I very much doubt that the readers of Gourmet want to consider, I'm paraphrasing here, but want to consider what lobsters feel when they go into the pot in the pages of their culinary magazine. And it was such a brilliant line because he stops you right there as you're reading and challenges you. And you go, do I want to read this? And then it's like, well, probably not. And then he goes on to consider at great length not only, the fact that lobsters are the only food that we bring into our kitchens and kill ourselves, but also he goes into the entire ethics of meat eating. And, is it proper for us to kill sentient beings just for our gustatory pleasure? And the piece was brilliant, and it terrified me, because I was absolutely convinced that hundreds of thousands of Gourmet subscribers were going to say, this isn't what I want from my magazine, cancel my subscription. David Foster Wallace was, he argued with Jocelyn over every word change, and there were a couple of changes he really didn't want to make. And she finally said, okay, we've got everything. We've done all the changes, but there's one change he doesn't want to make, and you're going to have to talk to him about it because I can't get him to budge.
What were the lines?
Well, there were a couple of things, and one was a reference to Mengele, and which was kind of over the top, and one was he was a great admirer of PETA, and I really said I won't be a shill for PETA in the pages of Gourmet magazine.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, this piece is brilliant. Anyone will publish it. The New Yorker will publish it. Harper will publish it. The Atlantic will publish it. Anybody would want this extraordinary piece of writing, and that's the answer. And I called him and said, you can sell this of course you can take it away and sell it anywhere you want, but you want it to be published in Gourmet because you want the people who are cooking those lobsters to be the ones who read this. And there was a silence, and he said, you're right. And so we came to a compromise.
So Gourmet magazine, which had this great history that you had worked at very hard throughout the recession for 10 years, an institution in American food culture and magazine culture, goes under in 2009. What was that like for you, and what did America lose with the closure of Gourmet magazine?
Well, I will tell you that there is not one day in my life that goes by that someone doesn't come up to me and tell me how much they miss the magazine and how much it meant to them. For me personally, It was devastating. I felt incredibly guilty. 65 people I really cared about lost their jobs. And the million subscribers to Gourmet lost a magazine that meant a lot to them. I still don't really understand why Condé Nast would give up that kind of connection to their readers. It is very difficult to matter that much to people as a magazine. And I don't mean My Gourmet. I mean Gourmet over the years really connected with its readers. And I don't think that there has been another magazine that tried so hard to balance pleasure and fun and all the wonderfulness around food with practical advice. And I mean, there's a reason why I called this book Save Me the Plums, because William Carlos Williams, who wrote the poem about the plums, he epitomized everything we were trying to do with the magazine. He was a doctor who worked with food people, who was also someone who was a groundbreaker in literature and lived a life of the mind and was, close friends with Ezra Pound and, all those people who went to Europe. And he epitomized what I think is kind of the best of America. And that's what the magazine was trying to do. And I think it was a real loss.
Well, you, Ruth, you are also an institution. We have not lost you. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for this. I really enjoyed it.
Ruth Reichl is the author, most recently, of Save Me the Plums, My Gourmet Memoir. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time.
This is Greg Coles, the Book Review's poetry editor. For National Poetry Month, we've invited poets onto the podcast to read a poem that's meaningful to them. This week, Eileen Miles, whose most recent collection is Evolution, reads John Wieners's poem, My Mother.
My mother, talking to strange men on the subway, doesn't see me when she gets on at Washington Street, but I hide in a booth at the side and watch her worried, strained face, the few years she has got left. Until at South Station I lean over and say, I've been watching you since you got on. She says in an artificial voice, oh, for heaven's sake, as if heaven cared. But I love her in the underground in her gray coat and hair, sitting there, one man over from me, talking together between the wire grates of a cage.
Emily Bazelon joins us now. She is my colleague here at The Times, where she is a staff writer at The Times Magazine, and she is also a co-host of the Political Gabfest from Slate. Her new book is called Charged, The New Movement to Transform American Prosecution and End Mass Incarceration. Emily, thanks for being here.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
Most readers are well aware of the problem of mass incarceration. What they may not be aware of is how that is linked together with any kind of issue involving prosecution. So let's start off with mass incarceration. I think it's one of those things people know that it exists. I don't think they necessarily have a sense of the extent of it.
Right. So there are 2.2 million people in jail or prison in America. There also are more than 10 million people who churn through the jail system every year. And so those two numbers coexist because a lot of jails are relatively short-term stays. The figure of 2.2 million is 5 times the number of people who were incarcerated in the United States in the 1970s. Back in the 70s, we had the same rate of incarceration as Scandinavia. They stuck with those numbers and we quintupled. So that's where you see this idea of mass incarceration come about.
Some people might hear that. And depending on where they're coming from politically, they might say, well, good. It's good. We're locking people up who commit crimes in this country, keeping them off the streets. I'm going to assume that's not your position. Why is it not good?
Incarceration has ballooned far beyond what we can argue is necessary for deterrence, and that we're just wasting a tremendous amount of resources, like our taxpayer money, at a huge human cost. And I would argue that this has become a real bipartisan concern. So you look at red states like Texas and Georgia and Oklahoma, they are also passing bills to reduce incarceration because the return on investment is so poor. And what I mean by that is that the states are spending billions of dollars. Many people, in a lot of states, most people, cycle back into jail and prison once they've been there. And so if you're just thinking about what this institution is accomplishing, you can ask a lot of questions that trouble fiscal conservatives as well as liberals who just think like this is a bad idea.
But for many conservatives and for liberals, but in different ways, it's not just a financial issue, it's a moral issue. And in America, there is a kind of dominant model of retribution as opposed to rehabilitation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And that, along with a fear of crime, which really dates from the 80s and the late 70s when crime started rising, those have been the two dominant forces in American criminal justice policy for decades. And we have seen politicians very successfully capitalize on those themes to propose and to promulgate exactly the kinds of policies you're talking about, these law and order, tough on crime policies. But that has started to change in the last few years.
Okay, so how did it quintuple? Is it just that law and order sort of mentality, or is it substantive changes in the laws, and how is it tied to prosecution?
Prosecutors are the missing piece in the incarceration puzzle. And what I mean by that is when you look at some of the changes in the 80s, a big one was to increase the number of prosecutors, and then another one was mandatory sentences. Once you have mandatory sentences in place, you tie the hands of a judge, right? And the whole idea was to do that. It was to eliminate discretion in the system. But when you take discretion from a judge, you give it to someone else. And that someone else is the prosecutor. Because the charges that a prosecutor brings and the plea bargain they're willing to agree to become the drivers of the outcome of the case. They drive the punishment. We didn't talk about that when we were passing mandatory minimum sentences in the 80s and 90s. We did not talk about the role of the prosecutor changing and effectively usurping the role of the judge in a lot of ways, but that's what happened.
So what was behind that increase in the number of prosecutors? Was that federal, or did that happen on the state level? Like, how did that happen and why?
It happened on the state and county level. I mean, one of the most important things about criminal justice in America is that the federal government is like a sideline. It really doesn't matter very much. Most cases, 95% of cases in criminal court go through state and local court, and 80% of the incarcerated population is held in state and county jails. So we're looking at states and counties deciding that they wanted to prosecute more crimes.
Why? Why in the 80s?
Well, the 80s is a time of rising crime, and there's just a lot of concern about it in a sense that America was kind of spinning out of control, that we needed a better handle. Do you remember the super predator rhetoric about teenagers? I mean, that was a line that Hillary and Bill Clinton were following in the 80s and 90s. There was just this sense that there were people who were dangerous and other, and we had to get rid of them. And very little awareness that almost all of them were going to come back into the system, and also that law enforcement is not necessarily the best way to prevent crime.
And the 80s was also a period in which there was a sense that we were in a drug crisis. I mean, often that's repeats throughout history, but that was the crack epidemic. I'm assuming that some of this was due to concerns about drugs.
Yes, absolutely. You see penalties for drug offenders go way up. And the idea that jail and prison is a good way to deal with drug addiction has a lot of purchase at the time. Now, we look back on the war on drugs, and it has been largely discredited, both as a way of dealing with addiction, but also because of its incredibly racialized nature. I mean, we've always throughout history punished Black people more than white people, but you see a ramping up of that in the drug war that I think a lot of us now see as unconscionable.
All right. I definitely want to go back to race because obviously that's a huge part of this. But going back to the policy of increased mandatory minimum sentences and the increase in the number of prosecutors, you mentioned that Hillary and Bill Clinton both favored these policies. Was there a bipartisan agreement? Were both Republicans and Democrats pushing for these policies?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you couldn't lose as running on tough and on crime, right? It was true for presidential candidates. It was true for state and local district attorney races. Absolutely. A lot of mayors ran on that. And, if you go back to a foundational moment in political history for criminal justice, the Willie Horton ads that George H.W. Bush used to defeat Michael Dukakis, it was Dukakis's small attempt at a kind of second chance approach to criminal justice that helped lose him the presidency. That lesson was not lost on everyone else.
So the idea of the crusading district attorney it's sort of a popular ideal in America, right? We think of these people as going after bad guys, as going after corruption, after the mob, after white collar crime. How far is that from the reality of what most prosecutors do?
White-collar crime is almost entirely prosecuted in the federal courts by U.S. attorneys who are appointed by the president and who handle a very small percentage of overall criminal cases. So that image has almost nothing to do, almost no bearing on the work of ordinary assistant DAs in the county courthouse. It's just a different world for them.
Who are the prosecutors out there at the county level versus who are the people that become the defense attorneys, if you could generalize?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think historically people have been drawn to be prosecutors for a few reasons. They see themselves as white hats, right? As protecting victims, as keeping the community safe. And I think a lot of them are genuinely going about their work in that way. They have high ethics. They're trying to do the right thing. One of the really painful aspects of the awareness of mass incarceration that is starting to spread is that it's forcing some prosecutors to realize that maybe they weren't doing good all along. That's something that I've heard some of them wrestle with. And that's a tricky thing as a professional, to think that the way you were doing your job might have done more harm than good.
So now to race, because obviously that's a big part of it. When we talk about mass incarceration, there is the sense that this is very much disproportionately affecting people of color. Is that true? And was it true before mass incarceration that the imprisoned population in America was disproportionately people of color as well?
You can go back to the efforts to undo Reconstruction, and you can find racialized and deeply racist policies, right? I mean, during Reconstruction, lots of states passed these very broad laws against loitering, and then they only picked up Black people for them. So this has a deep history in our culture, which should not be surprising. It is also true that mass incarceration the costs of it have been largely borne by the Black community. You can't understate it, honestly. I mean, the numbers are shocking. And when you start talking to low-income Black people, almost all of them have a relative in jail or prison. And it just is this deep current that runs through communities. I should also say that in the last few years, as incarceration has started to drop in urban areas, it is continuing to rise in the white rural population. And it's starting to be true that you talk to white people in those communities, and they also are affected by our prison system. And, a bunch of different Black people have said to me as I've done my reporting, I wonder if this is what it's going to take to end mass incarceration, white people really feeling affected by it. And of course, this is again linked to drugs. It's linked to the opioid crisis.
Your first book was Sticks and Stones, Defeating the Culture of Bullying and Rediscovering the Power of Character and Empathy. Now, in a certain way, that feels like a major leap to this. And then in another sense, it feels kind of like there is an obvious link. How did you get from there to this subject?
Focusing on bullying made me think so much about root causes of bad behavior and the overlap between violence and victimization. And those issues have really followed me into this new work. With Sticks and Stones, I was reporting in schools, and education was a major component. But there is, of course, concern about the schools to prison pipeline. And so when I was thinking of that, of people in trouble and wrestling with systems that don't work, that's very much connected to this new book.
So you have a Yale Law degree, and we've talked a lot about major intractable issues in the criminal justice system. But that's not the way you chose to go about writing this book and explaining this issue. Instead, you write primarily about two individual people, Kevin and Nora. Why did you decide to take that approach?
I think the best thing I can do as a journalist is to be a storyteller and a translator. And what I mean by that is the law and legal issues are like dense and complicated. I have trouble remembering the cases I read. I don't think that it's fair to expect people to wrestle with all of the complexity unless you can really make it come alive for them. And so when I do my work, I look for stories that will allow me to illustrate what I want people to understand. I want you to see the criminal justice system through the eyes of the people who are experiencing it. And so I picked these stories to illustrate two different facets of American prosecution right now. And I care the most about the narrative aspect of the book because I think that if this book is going to make people feel as well as think, it will hopefully reach a broader audience, but also I hope have a bigger impact.
I want to talk specifically about both Kevin and Nora's stories. But before I get to that, I mean, how do you decide, okay, these are the two people that I'm going to blow out and really go into their stories? Because you did a lot of reporting. There are lots of terrible stories around prosecutorial overreach and mass incarceration. How did you come to decide these are the two people I'm going to focus on?
When I look for people whose stories to tell, I look for people who are very vivid in how they describe what has happened to them and who are interested in hanging out with me. Mm-hmm. These are really time-consuming reporting projects, and I need to be able to follow people over time. That's a big thing to ask for. So I don't announce it in the beginning because it would be like asking to get married on a first date. But I try to figure out, how game is this person? If I keep showing back up, how are they going to feel about it? That's like a big component to me.
Are these the two people that you started off with, or did you kind of go down several routes and then ultimately narrow it down? How did you get to them?
Nora's case I worked on for a really long time, and it took me like 10 months to convince her to talk to me. She was still in prison when I started reporting. And then when I met Nora, I found her very compelling and to be a really good storyteller. Kevin was not the first person I met. I knew I was interested in this gun court in Brooklyn that I write about because it's an odd bird. Most specialized courts are for helping people. They're like drug treatment courts or mental health. But in Brooklyn, they had started this court for gun possession in which prosecutors held all the cards because of New York's mandatory sentences for gun possession. And I should say here, we're just talking about having an unlicensed gun. We're not talking about shooting anyone. Still, mandatory prison sentences for loaded guns. For just having one. For just having one, and it can be in your house or someone else's house. So I talked to lots of defendants in the beginning, and I stayed in touch with some of them as well. But Kevin's story was compelling, and he's just an excellent describer of his world, and he was willing to keep hanging out with me, though I did reach the limit of my white middle-aged mom reporting capabilities.
You begin the book with him. What's his story?
Kevin's story is that he lives in Brownsville. It's where he grew up. That's the neighborhood in New York that has one of the densest concentrations of public housing in the country. It used to be known as New York's murder capital. Violence is down in Brownsville, but it's still present. And Kevin had a friend who had a gun. We know he had a gun because he flashed it on Facebook, and the cops saw it.
Are the police just sitting there scrolling through Facebook looking for things like this?
Yes. If you have a particular kind of criminal record and you're a poor black kid in Brooklyn, yes, they are just scrolling through Facebook. So when the cops came to this apartment, Kevin was in the apartment with a few other friends of theirs, and he actually happened to open the door. It's just a weird coincidence. The cops were really about to knock when Kevin opened the door so someone could leave. So he's standing there. He knows it's the police. There's a gun on a table behind him. He has a split second to react, and he has this impulse out of loyalty to his friend to grab the gun. He knew his friend had a serious criminal record, and Kevin didn't. And he picked up the gun kind of in this act of rash loyalty. He had this crazy thought of flushing it down the toilet, which demonstrates to me that when you're a young man this age, you're not necessarily thinking straight. He would agree with that. His mother was really agreed with that. So he was the one who the gun was on. And from the point of view of the police and the prosecutors, they don't care whose gun it really is. That's not their concern. They care about proving that you had it in your possession at that moment. Kevin said, I'm going to be a man and take the charge. He was trying to argue that the cops should let everyone else go. Mm-hmm. And so, look, you can see this as a misguided act, but from his point of view, he was trying to be loyal to a friend. And I should say that my account of this is not just based on his story. I've talked to other people who were there that night or close by.
So who is he? Who is Kevin? He's 19 or 20 years old. What's he doing with his life? What's his background? And did he have any kind of criminal record?
He didn't have any adult criminal record. He had a couple of youthful offenses. But in New York, his record was clean because happily those can get dismissed. He hadn't graduated from high school, but he'd been working in and out. He was living with his mom. He had a girlfriend, was thinking about trying to move in with her in Queens, and kind of how to finish growing up.
So what happens? He's there. He's got the gun. The police come in.
They arrest him, and he is quickly transferred to this new gun court in Brooklyn. And that's bad news because the gun court is a project of Mayor Bill de Blasio's, and the whole idea behind it is to fast-track gun prosecutions and to send more people to prison. So
I want to stop you there because people think of Mayor Bill de Blasio as a liberal Democrat New York politician sensitive about issues of race. Why would he have come up with this idea?
Well, tough on crime sells for politicians. And this was true in 2016 for Bill de Blasio. He also had a very rocky start with the New York Police Department when he became mayor. He cut back on stop and frisk, which was like the cops' favorite tool for picking people up on the street. He talked about how he had warned his own biracial teenage son to be very careful around the police. There was a moment in 2015 when a couple of cops are shot to death in New York, and at their funerals, when de Blasio tries to speak, rows and rows of cops turn their back on him.
Yes.
Yes, remember
that?
that?
Was a moment.
Right. So de Blasio is trying to come back from that moment with the cops, and this gun court and this effort to increase gun prosecutions in New York, it's called Project Fast Track. It has a kind of snazzy name, very much comes out of this dynamic between de Blasio and the cops. And what de Blasio says in the moment at the press conference is that these are the city's evildoers. The reality is gun court is only for people who get arrested for possessing a gun. It is not for the shooters.
He has not used this gun at all. He has just picked it up.
Yeah. I mean, it's possible that there's more to the story than that when you say, like, you know, I wasn't there for all of this. But having talked to a number of people involved, I would say, yes, that's the case.
So he gets to this new fast-track gun court. What happens?
He gets a lawyer, a really good lawyer, luckily, from Brooklyn Defender Services, and she works with a social worker. So they start trying to make him look like someone the prosecutors could take a bet on. The goal is to get him into this very special, maybe unique program in Brooklyn. It goes by the initials YCP, stands for Youth and Congregations in Partnership. It's a social work diversion program for offenders under the age of 23 in Brooklyn. The DA's office has been running it for years, and it has become an escape hatch from gun court. The deal is you plead guilty, you accept a prison sentence, it hangs over your head, but instead of going to prison, you work with a social worker from the DA's office. And if you make it through the program, then the charges against you go away, and they're actually dismissed and sealed.
How does mandatory minimum sentencing play into this? What is the mandatory minimum sentence for gun possession in New York?
In New York, if you're caught with a loaded gun, the maximum charge is a 3.5-year minimum mandatory sentence, maximum 15 years. There are other choices on the menu of options for prosecutors. They can drop down to 2-year mandatory sentence. They can go all the way down to a misdemeanor. And so for me, gun court was an ideal place to study prosecutorial power. I was watching prosecutors make all the key decisions. One of the cases I followed, a judge asked the prosecutor to drop the charge down to a misdemeanor because she didn't want to send the defendant to jail. The prosecutor said no. The defendant went to jail.
So the common American perception is the judge has the power. The judge does the sentencing. Like that's where the ultimate decision making happens. What's changed? Was that never correct?
Well, I mean, it was more correct. And then mandatory minimum sentences changed that. It's also worth mentioning the way bail and pretrial detention works in this equation. Judges set bail, but in reality, they are very reluctant often to deviate from the prosecutor's demand because if the prosecutor asks for a lot of bail, they let someone out instead by setting low bail, and then something happens. That's going to be on the judge. It's much easier to take a political risk if you have the prosecutor backing you up. And it's worth pausing here for a moment to consider how much the bad headline about Someone who got some mercy and then hurt someone drives criminal justice policy. It is incredibly powerful as a narrative. That was true in Brooklyn when I started reporting in the gun court. And it's like a shadow that hangs over everybody in the system, judges, prosecutors, and lawmakers.
So let's go back to Kevin because he was lucky he got a good lawyer, right? I'm assuming that helped. What ended up happening to him? What was his sentence? Where did he go from there?
He started working with the lawyer and social worker at Brooklyn Defender Services, and he was doing well. He was signing up for GED classes, looking for work, things that suggested that he might be a good candidate for this diversion program. He was not accepted into it, however, until the prosecutors lost a hearing. And what I mean by that is that when the police officer who arrested Kevin testified, he revealed that he had questioned Kevin about the ownership of the gun before reading him his Miranda warning. So this is the part where they say, like, anything you say can and may be used against you. So in other words, the officer had asked Kevin potentially incriminating questions before giving him this protection that the Miranda rights afford. And the judge ruled on Kevin's side, saying that the prosecution was not going to be able to introduce Kevin's admission that he had the gun if there was a trial. It was unlikely there would be a trial in this case because trials are very unlikely writ large in the system right now. But this legal weakness in the case caused the prosecutors to take a second look at Kevin and make this offer of diversion, which was a way of, sweetening the deal they were offering in the plea bargain.
So that all sounds kind of good, right, for Kevin? I mean, you might look at this case and say, well, maybe he shouldn't have been charged in the first place with this crime, but he got off.
Well, I wouldn't say he got off because I think going through this diversion program is like a serious and strenuous effort that requires a lot of work on the part of the young people who are in it. Also, there have been further consequences for him, I should say. Even though the case is supposed to be dismissed and sealed, the police have a record of it. And they're still coming after Kevin. Long after he'd finished this diversion program, they came to his house in the middle of the night. They said they thought he had a gun. They tore the apartment apart.
Why did they think he had a gun?
I don't know. Presumably because a confidential informant suggested that. But there was no gun there. And the fact that they were targeting him is directly linked to this gun case against him, even though he had done all the things that he was told would mean that this case would be dismissed and sealed.
So the social services program sounds like it has the potential to help someone. I mean, did it? What was Kevin's takeaway from that?
It did help him. Kevin had a very good relationship with his social worker in YCP, whose name is Maxim Kreingold. They were an unlikely pair. Maxim is this Russian Jewish immigrant. He wears a yarmulke. He has an accent. He deeply cares about and understands his clients. And there's no question that Kevin got something out of his relationship with Maxim. And I don't mean that in a transactional sense. Like, it helped him grow up. Maxim made sure he was looking for a job. He got his GED. There were other milestones that passed during the year. And yet, there's also this surveillance aspect of being in this program that was not helpful, I think, at all, and creates a danger that people who are being told that they're going to be completely free of the system once they've completed this diversion program are in fact still being hounded by it in some way. So I think there's just this dual complicated nature to how this is playing out. And, you said before, it seems like this is a good thing. And I think it is true that the DA's office in Brooklyn, and Eric Gonzalez is the elected DA, the fact that they've created this escape hatch, that's a tribute to Eric Gonzalez's commitment to second chances. There's no other DA in New York who is offering anything like a diversion program for people accused of felonies. So that's significant, but it still has this sort of good and bad aspect.
You have in your book a kind of lengthy appendix, 21 Principles for 21st Century Prosecutors. Tell us a little bit about what this is, and is this kind of diversion program one of the things that will help?
Yes, I think increasing opportunities for diversion programs is a really important way to make jail and prison the last resort, which is a big goal of the criminal justice reform effort. there's a sort of caveat to that, which is that whenever you start creating these new programs, you also can be widening the net, right? It sounds benevolent. Let's just do diversion programs for everyone. Let's have prison sentences hanging over everyone's head. That's a danger that we need to be aware of. But in our current state of using jail and prison as the first resort for a lot of people who are not a threat, we need more alternatives.
We don't have time to go through all 21 of these principles, but if you could give listeners a sense of one that you think is maybe the most important, or if not, perhaps the most actionable on a kind of voter level.
I think it's super important to ask prosecutors how they're charging cases. And this is tricky. It's not like an easy thing, but it's probably the most far-reaching change that prosecutors can make because it affects so many cases. And understanding their philosophy of charging is really important. The other thing I would emphasize is thinking of drug problems and mental illness problems as issues that are more properly addressed as much as possible outside of the criminal justice system. So many people who fall into the system are struggling with mental illness or substance abuse, and realizing that we can't fix this problem with punitive tools is really crucial.
All right. Well, that leaves probably 19 or so other principles in the book. We also didn't have a chance to talk about Nora's story, but Emily, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Emily Bazelon is the author, most recently, of Charged, the New Movement to Transform American Prosecution and End Mass Incarceration, reviewed this week on the cover of the book review by David Lapp. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the literary world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela.
So, very interesting kind of literature this week.
Yes. Next week, what I presume will be one of the biggest new novels of the year is going to come out. It's E.L. James's new romance, which is called The Mister. And this is her first work of original fiction since 50 Shades of Grey, which had an incredible impact on the publishing industry. I think it completely altered the literary landscape and the way people think about fan fiction and erotica and how mainstream it can go. And I think it changed the entertainment industry too. So I had a chance to interview her about it, and I was really curious sort of how she manages both running this kind of franchise, which is like $1 billion franchise that emerged from her debut novel, while also trying to stretch and write something new. So it was pretty fascinating.
So that first book, 50 Shades of Grey, was self-published.
It was actually published by a small Australian press, but before that, it was published online for free as fan fiction. It was actually Twilight fan fiction, which was a very popular fandom at the time. E.L. James got really into Twilight. She loved romance, and like a lot of Twilight fans, she started coming up with her own erotic take on the series. Because I think the funny thing about Twilight is it's very chaste. It's for teenagers, and that was sort of part of its popularity, but it left a lot of room for other writers' imaginations to come in and say, well, what if they did this? And so the kind of unique spin, although it wasn't totally unique, there were other writers, fan fiction writers doing this too, but the spin that E.L. James put on it was she made Edward Cullen, the vampire, a sort of sadomasochist, and Bella, the demure conquest of his, who is the human, she became like this college student who becomes his kind of apprentice in this BDSM relationship. So it was very boundary pushing. It was very, I think, groundbreaking in terms of taking these kind of niche sexual fetishes that people sort of whispered about and putting them really into the mainstream. I mean, like into Target, where they started selling blindfolds and handcuffs in the 50 Shades section. So it's hard to kind of wrap your head around the impact that those books have. But talking to her about them, I think she also, like a lot of writers who have a massive success, you can kind of feel after a while oppressed by your own success, because while she's been working on this new book and she had the idea for it in 2009, her fans have been insisting on more sequels, and she's been rewriting the trilogy from the perspective of Christian, the hero. You know, they were originally from Anna's perspective. So
it's like the Harry Potter trap.
Exactly. I mean, she was involved in the movie. She was a co-producer. So not to mention she was involved in all the merchandising as well. So it is kind of a trap. I mean, it's obviously a happy one.
A gilded trap.
Yeah. Everyone, I'm sure, would love to sell 150 million copies.
Wow.
But she
150 million copies.
Yes.
Put that into perspective. Like, what is that in the landscape of bestsellers?
It's It's massive. I mean, Harry Potter has sold more than 400 million, so that's kind of a category of its own. But for a trilogy of books, adult novels, not a fantasy series, 150 million is astonishing.
Well, a certain kind of fantasy.
Yes, exactly. It is a certain kind of fantasy. So I did talk to her about that, and she said she does feel quite nervous about starting this new phase of her career. And this novel, while it has a lot of explicit sex, so people won't be disappointed on that front, it's not as boundary pushing or kind of risque. It's kind of a more traditional romance. It involves a wealthy, handsome British man who becomes an earl unexpectedly when his brother dies, who falls in love with his cleaning lady, who's from Albania. So it's sort of got a Cinderella-esque / Downton Abbey mashup, and various things ensue.
What's she like?
She is, so I was actually a little bit apprehensive about meeting her because I knew that she hated to give interviews. Everyone had told me this, her publicist, her agent. So I wasn't sure what to expect, but she was incredibly friendly, very funny, pretty unguarded, apart from, her agent was on hand and occasionally steered the conversation. Mm-hmm. For example, she was talking a little bit about the 50 Shades, the first movie, which she wasn't too pleased with parts of it. And so her agent would sometimes interject. But she seems extremely down to earth and kind of like somebody who is still looking at her life from the outside and wondering how she got there. Mm-hmm. I think one thing that's interesting about her is, she was fully formed as an adult and had a whole career before this happened to her. She worked for decades in television as a producer on various programs. And so this was really her hobby. And when I was asking her, what do you do for fun when you're not writing and running your business? She said, well, I need a hobby because writing used to be my hobby, and she hasn't developed another one yet.
She'll have to take up knitting.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Alexandra, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now are critics Dwight Garner, Jen Salai, and Parl Sagel. Hey, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, let's start with you, Jen. You reviewed a highly anticipated book this week.
Yes, it's Working by Robert Caro, and it's his first book since 2012. And in 2012, he published the 4th volume of his massive Lyndon Johnson biography. And he said then, and he's saying now, that the volume that he's currently working on is the 5th volume, and it's going to be the last. But in the meantime, we have this book, which is a peek into his process, and it's very charming. It's short. You could probably read it in, several hours. Parts of it have been excerpted in The New Yorker. Actually, a quarter of it was an essay that was published about 20 years ago about his process of writing The Power Broker, his biography of Robert Moses. And so this book, it's really charming. It's a collection of these essays, personal reflections, snippets of interviews that he's given where he talks about how he's come to write these, really sort of deep investigative dives into people's legacies and power. And it's funny because I think in a way, on the one hand, it can seem fairly revealing because he does talk about, going into the archives. I think the LBJ archives right now has about 45 million pieces of paper. And he says that he's determined to turn every page, maybe almost every page in this case. And he talks about his research, and a lot of it is conducted with his wife, Ina, who helps him in the archives. And you really get the sense that he's really devoted his life to this project, that he sort of sees himself almost like a steward in a way of something that sort of overtakes him, and he just feels compelled to do it. At the same time, though, I think for people who are familiar with his LBJ books and his Moses biography, that there's a lot of the stories that he recounts in this book are sort of distilled versions of stories he actually does go into in some of his books because, his books are so comprehensive, and he does, he wants to methodically build the case in this book about why he comes to the conclusions that he does. And so he is very explicit in these books about how he tracked down a particular political operative to see what their relationship was with LBJ, for example. So I was charmed by this book. I enjoyed it. I'm not sure how much new stuff I felt was in it.
Jen, what is it about Caro? I mean, he's a fairly social guy. It's easy to see him around. If you live in New York City, he's here and there. He's out eating. And there's something about him that he's almost as close as we have in the literary world right now to a secular saint. He's just revered.
Yeah.
People, the seas part for him in crowds. And what is it about him at this point?
It's interesting you say that. I don't think I've ever seen him in person, but I do think it's the work. I mean, deservedly, this is somebody who does something that nobody else really does, which is not only combine, the archival research of a historian, the interview tactics of an investigative journalist, which he was before starting the Moses biography, but he also, will go and do this. It's almost like a version of method acting where he goes and lives in Texas Hill Country for 3 years in order to understand what life was like. And I think he's just so devoted and committed, and his works are just, they really change people's understanding of these two figures.
Speaking of Caro's methods of interviewing, I got a really great email from one of our listeners, Virginia Agnew, and she is the daughter-in-law of the late Senator Herring, who was also one of LBJ's aides. And he was interviewed several times for the book. She sat in on what was to be Caro's final interview, which is for his upcoming volume. And she wrote me this: "I'm sure you've met Caro and know what a lovely man he is, but watching him conduct an interview is breathtaking. He takes no notes and uses no tape recorder and can pull from his encyclopedic memory the most obscure and arcane of details. They were discussing business dealings post-presidential term, as best I remember. Caro knew dates, numbers, names, and fine points of transactions so readily that he easily facilitated my father-in-law's retelling of stories of years past. Amazing."
Wait, is
Wow.
the
No
implication
notes?
there that he takes no notes during interviews?
He says he
That's
takes
terrifying.
In the book, he says he takes
Yes,
notes.
and he says
doesn't
that-
use a recorder, right?
He only takes notes, and he writes when there's like a silence in the
That's
interview.
right.
He writes SU for shut up so that he doesn't try to break the silence and stop
Yeah.
the person from revealing
I think
something.
what she meant was that he didn't bring any notes in with him, but he
Right.
just
Okay.
knew all of
This
this
is this.
material
Got
offhand. And
Yeah.
It may be a Trump era thing, don't you think? This idea that this man is spending so much time unearthing the truth, like he's just this sort of secular saint of research and digging and factual accuracy, and we all miss accuracy a little bit.
I don't know if it's the Trump era thing because I feel like it predated Trump. I think maybe part of it is the fact that he's in this long form narrative, this sort of, we live in such a fast-paced culture of little bits and pieces and kind of quick takes, that this is someone who's dedicating decades to this project.
Yeah, I mean, there's something. I just interviewed him 2 days ago, and I asked him because so he doesn't have a computer. There's no Google in his life. There's no Wikipedia. And years ago, he forced himself to just always write longhand. And I asked him why. I mean, you don't have to do this. And he said it's to make himself work slower. And so that element of time that he builds into his thinking, that he builds into his relationships with people, all of that does feel very different from how we live. But I also think that there's something about the way that he wants to understand political power, but then tell people how it works that feels holy. There's a moral mission behind his biography. He's not interested, I think, in these lives as lives. I think that there's something about he wants to tell people that this is how somebody like Robert Moses acquired political power. How? Without being elected. How did he wield this? How do we still feel it today? Right. That feels very, like he's on our side. He's sort of fulfilling some other kind of function the way that a journalist might, some kind of check on power that these books are about.
And both Moses and Johnson followed, very different people, but followed this arc of young idealism.
Right.
Followed by doing many, many good but also terrible things, and then really ending on a decline of total abuse of power, or what many perceive to be.
Jen, how old is he now?
Caro is 83.
So is he going to make it? Paul, you just spoke with him in public. Is he going to make it? How's he doing?
Carl, answer this. Tell us.
How's he doing?
He's good. I mean, his memories just seems incredible. Somebody asked a question about Hudson Yards, and you could see him get all animated. So I think there's a lot of fire there. There's still a lot of writing he wants to do.
All right, Dwight, you reviewed someone incredibly young to be writing a second book.
What a great week I had. It's funny. She is young, Sally Rooney. What is she, 28, 29?
I don't want to think about it.
It's terrifying.
I think she might be 27. I'm
too
sorry.
depressing.
27.
Possibly.
But it's like my daughter's age, just about. American writers used to start a lot earlier than they do now. 27, 26 seems radically young, but Styron and Mailer and all those guys had 2 or 3 novels under their belts by then. So I find it interesting that a lot of the people we think of as young writers these days are in their 40s, 50s, some of them. And at any rate, I reviewed Sally Rooney's new book. She's the young Irish writer who had a hit in England and Ireland 2 years ago with Conversations with Friends, and now she has a new novel called Normal People. And if you haven't read her, she's just a treat. Her books are very accessible. They're about obsessive young love affairs. And her sentences are just really short, smart, well-deployed. She's very witty. And she's also very dark. I mean, these are about obsessive love. And these stories are disturbing in many ways. They're about dominance and subjugation in many ways, sexually and otherwise. But at the same time, there's a layer of fine observation about class, about money, about everything. And you get the sense of a young writer who's sort of got a lot of skills for someone who's that age and can do, you just try to think, where can she go next? And it seems like she can go almost anywhere to me.
She's an extremely political person outside the books. Do you see that in her novels?
It comes up in little ways. There are a lot of little jabs about it's about young people, as I said, teenagers moving into their 20s and falling in love often for the first time, having sex for the first time, and realizing that ideas might mean something in their lives. And communism comes up a lot in her books, and socialism, and the idea of what a good life should be and how we should live and how money should be distributed in the world. And so that comes up, but it's in jabby ways. It's not
It doesn't feel like a polemic.
She does not write polemics, but all of her characters love to sit around and sort of chew the fat about how they're going to change the world if they could. So it comes and goes.
So, Parl, you reviewed a very different kind of book this week.
I did. But at the same time, I had a good week. I reviewed a new book by a Mexican musician and writer named Julian Herbert. He's such a cool writer. I mean, I think there's this genre that exists in Mexican literature called the Crónica, which is part essay, fiction, rant, poem. It's just everything stuffed into one. And he writes these books that are sort of very disobedient and unruly. He wrote a book a few years ago that was kind of his breakup book, translated into English, called Tomb Song, about his childhood and being raised in brothels where his mother worked, and about his mother's death and his own sorts of druggy sexual interludes. And it's a book about memory and mourning and motherland. The new book that I reviewed is called The House of the Pain of Others, which isn't a reference to Sontag. It's the nickname of the local soccer stadium in a town called Torreon in Mexico, where in the early part of the 20th century, 300 Chinese immigrants were slaughtered in the streets. And he wants to excavate this story that both is always threatening to be forgotten and yet is constantly being sort of resurfaced every few years. Somebody will write some sort of study. It's still very much part of the local lore. And he goes to Torreon and he wants to talk to people. He tries to find any, remaining members of the Chinese community. He wants to talk to taxi drivers. He wants to understand how people have metabolized this sort of crime, how they understand it. And it's kind of, in the vein of everything he writes, sort of this leggy, rangy book that doesn't, especially it's at times, seem to want to make an argument, but it does end up sort of telling this rich story of how something like this gets forgotten, gets misunderstood. And then he makes a really interesting point about how this particular story, and I think lots of stories of these particular crimes, get misunderstood in a very, very particular way. So for many years it was understood that, or it was thought that, well, it was this working class surge of resentment against outsiders. And he finds something very different. And he finds that, no, this was a very middle class and upper class phobia of the Chinese immigrants that then spread out throughout society in these very, not patterned is not the right word, but in these very deliberate ways. So he wants to understand and he wants to describe how this happened. And it's a very difficult book to read. It's dense. It kind of, it doesn't lead you from point A to B in the same way that I was thinking of the Patrick Radden Keefe book, right? Which seems to have much more of a narrative structure. This book doesn't have that, but it kind of invents its own form and circular kind of Worrell-like way of circling and sort of studying this particular trauma that doesn't feel like past at all.
All right. 3 very different books. Dwight, you reviewed?
Sally Rooney's new novel. It's called Normal People.
Jen?
Robert Caro's new book called Working.
And Parl?
Julian Herbert's book, The House of the Pain of Others.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Head Stepper Media with the great help of my colleague, Don Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.